I've really had a great time speaking with many of you in the audience here over the last 24 or so hours, and I realized that many of the perspectives around the table here are more or less focused on local or regional scale issues, which is fantastic. That's where we really need to engage change. But what I'm going to talk to you about now is kind of more of the 30,000 foot or 10,000 meter, if you think metric, 10,000 meter view of what might be happening globally when you accumulate all of these local concerns. I'm going to be talking about rivers, and I'm going to be talking about rivers because they're the single largest sustainable water supply that serves humankind. And I'm going to be talking about rivers in the Anthropocene. And for those of you who follow this little debate, we, I guess officially, are still in the Holocene. And there's a move afoot to try to recognize the fact that humans have now impacts at the planetary scale. And instead of calling it the Holocene, which is the current geological epoch, maybe we need to recognize the fact that humans are really calling the shots here and doing so in a very significant way. And perhaps it merits a change in the geological naming convention. If you want to see that debate come alive in the public media, take a look at The Economist from about 2 years ago. I think there was a 2012 set of articles on whether this was a sensible course of action or not. So the little subtext here is posed as a question. I hope I can answer the question in my next 15 minutes or so. Where are we and where are we flowing? So I'm going to hit the button here. And that very last image that you saw was of planet Earth. And I know when I was a kid, I remember being quite inspired by Apollo 8, seeing the Earth rise over the moon. And really that blue marble really had us recognize that we live on a blue planet. It's really dominated by water. But we're really talking about fresh water here, and we're really talking about rivers, which is the main sustainable supply for humanity. And I want to put this in a context, and I want to put it in the global context. And in order to do this in relative terms, I should mention I grew up in New York City, and I will do what any good New York City kid does. When you have something in relative terms to express, you pull out the Empire State Building. Mm-hmm. And if we say that all the water on Earth represents all 100 stories of the Empire State Building, we can begin to ask, well, how much of that is fresh water? And I'm sure that many in the audience know that it's not that much. And it's about 2.5 stories of that 100-story building, which is all the water on Earth. So most of the world's water is trapped, as it were, we're freshwater people, trapped in the oceans. 2.5% or 2.5 stories is fresh water related to this building. Then we could ask the question, well, how about groundwater? You know, groundwater is a water resource for humankind. If you look at the amount of groundwater that's stored that would be potentially accessible by human beings, if it were uniformly distributed where humans are, you'd see that that shrinks down to the height of a person, one human being. And now we're going to really talk about rivers. So now I usually play a game with my class where I go through about 15 minutes of guessing how far down does this get. And I won't tease this crowd at all. I'll just hit the button here. I found it shocking when we first did these calculations. But if you talk about the water contained in the river channels on planet Earth, it's a penny. It's literally a penny's worth of that height of the Empire State Building. So it's a very, very precious resource. It's really what we're talking about. As Pat mentions, we're really struggling within drainage basins, within states, within regions. So that's the global number. Okay, so if we're talking about the Colorado River Basin, you're taking just a thin sliver of that penny, and that's the kind of resource we're talking about in global terms. Okay, so what's the situation today, and what's been our response, because we're really talking about action here. I'm going to go through a couple of maps. These maps were published as a international effort involving several of my partners from around the world to really map out what we call threats to these inland water systems. They're threats to rivers globally. We published this in Nature in 2010. And this map on the top is our best guess as to what the incident threat is. And what we mean by that is, what's the threat to these water systems out in the ambient world, in the environment from which humans draw their sustenance in terms of water resources, or if you're an aquatic life form, you've got to live in, okay? And the immediate check that we did was to look at China and India, and several people on the panel that I worked with were very familiar with the water systems there. They did a lot of reading, and the literature certainly would support the fact that China has very threatened water systems, as does India. And the color bars here mean red means bad, lots of threat, green and blue, less threat, okay? And we sort of patted ourselves on the back, and then we realized, well, let's take a closer look at this. And guess what we saw? We saw that places like Europe or places like the United States, and Canada is not immune to this statement, also show a lot of red, a lot of high threat. And we said, how could this possibly be? It has to do with the way we made these calculations. What we did is we produced a single aggregate measure of threat that really is, has emerged from a set of calculations on many individual stressors, like poor land management or pollution or overuse of water or the introduction of exotic species into aquatic ecosystems. And the sheer force of stacking up all of that information made us realize that all of those stressors are associated with some form of development, whether it's for agricultural development or for urban development or the economy in general. And what we concluded is that as a simple byproduct of development, and I would say maybe sloppy development, we leave a very, very harsh fingerprint of that economic development on the water systems, even in places where we know better. Even in places like Europe, where there are framework directives to try to protect these water systems, the body politic forces their leaders to address environmental issues. There's the technology available to potentially prevent these problems, but we choose, in a sense, not to do this. We felt a little bit queasy publishing this, but we checked our numbers, and indeed, even in places like Europe and the United States, there's severe impairment. I wanted to make I guess I was talking to Brent Patterson. I don't see him in the audience here. Oh, there you are, Brent. And I said I would make a provocative statement, and my provocative statement is at the bottom of this, this graph. And despite all of our best efforts, and despite good examples to the contrary, I would say that there's prima facie evidence from these maps that we're not good stewards of our water systems. And even though we tried to aim for integrated water resource management, the evidence that I'm showing here is that it's certainly not been adopted universally, and it's actually quite evident that there are threats where you precisely don't expect threats to be, the developed world. Okay, now that map is a little bit counterintuitive, because I said that that was the mapping of threats in the ambient environment, the environment from which we draw our water resources and which aquatic life lives in. And on the left side of this dual panel here is the Eastern Hemisphere, where, sure enough, a place like Europe, if you're a fish, don't go to Europe, because there's a lot of dam and impoundments and interbasin transfers and lots of residual pollution from literally centuries of pollution. Go to a place like Africa where there's less development. It's a lot safer for you as a fish, or as a crustacean, or as an aquatic plant. But of course, if we're talking about human water security, that's not really our picture. I would go to Europe and expect there to be good water security. I would avoid a place like sub-Saharan Africa or India or China from the standpoint of human water security. And that map on the right is, I think, the intuitive mental map that we'd all would have of human water security. That map on the right is kind of the way you would think through this issue. But the starting point, what's happening in the background, has to be transformed in a major way to get to the more intuitive map on the right. And that conversion is made tangibly. This is the action, I guess. The action humankind has implemented in converting a bad situation into a better situation, at least for rich countries of the world, involves about $750 billion a year of investment in infrastructure. That's our action plan, okay? And the result is, because this is distributed over space and it's distributed over economies, there are winners and losers. And as I say, if you want human water security, good examples, Go to a place like Europe. Turn the faucet on in Paris. You get pretty clean water, and it's there all the time. But don't do so in sub-Saharan Africa, because there'll be some surprises waiting for you as you tend to encounter water supplies that might actually make you sick. What we've uncovered, we believe, is a pandemic strategy or approach to water management, and it's the last line there, where you develop, and I say develop sloppily in many cases, and you impair the systems, you screw them up, and then you fix them, you repair them. So impair and then repair. And we see this globally. We also see this historically over time, many examples in the historical literature of people basically using and abusing their water systems and then fixing them, often at great expense. Okay, so what's our action plan? Our action plan here, our response, is to throw a lot of money and concrete and chemicals and technical know-how at the problem to the tune of about $750 billion a year. There's some iconic images on the left side of the screen there. It's been summarized actually as a blueprint for the water sector. There's a McKinsey report published in 2010 called Charting Our Water Future. It appeared about the same time those maps that I showed you appeared. And that's the blueprint for the water sector. Well, guess what? If you look in that document, you see a lot of the plans for this imagery on the left, big reservoirs and sophisticated water treatment facilities, interbasin transfers, things like this. But you see scarce mention of the word ecosystems, no mention at all of the notion of ecosystem services, no mention at all of biodiversity and aquatic biodiversity, which is quite a surprise to us, because those of us who've actually looked at this recognize that some of these very facilities are really stressing the biodiversity of the planet. And this graphic that you see on the top right, and probably the best thing to do is to focus on the bars there. Those bars are looking at the levels of species loss and imperilment in 3 domains. On the left is the marine domain, the middle is the terrestrial landmass, and on the right are freshwater ecosystems, okay? And if you look at the degree of imperilment on a per area basis, freshwater ecosystems show orders of magnitude, perhaps 1,000 times more intense species loss per unit area of that habitat than, let's say, the marine environment. And that, in large measure, has to do with things like pollution and mismanagement of water quality, but as well, it has to do with the overuse of water engineering that interferes with the life cycles of many of these species that we're talking about in that rightmost bar. Okay, now we're going to have to fish for a little start button in the back for an animation here. And what you're seeing lighting up here is blues and reds. Is the pandemic construction, this is the action plan, pandemic construction of water resource facilities. And in this particular case, we're looking at hydropower dams where it's anticipated currently constructed or recently constructed dams and those that are planned. Probably is going to expand by 75% the global capacity for hydropower. If we watch this over this couple of centuries, you'll see that it's pretty much dominated by the north or the developed world, but soon it's being taken over. A lot of the action is going to be happening in the developing world, and in precisely the same places where I just struggled to make the point that there's going to be severe biodiversity loss. Okay? But the point is, this is the modern world. This is the modern world of the water engineer, and it's the fabric of the 21st century hydrologic system of the planet. We've got to, in essence, live with this and manage it in different contexts. You want to protect biodiversity, there's an immediate problem. You want to feed hungry people in Africa, well, you're going to have to build some of these reservoirs for irrigation. So there's an immediate trade-off and an interesting moral dilemma at the same time. What are some of the alternatives to the status quo? What are some alternative action plans? You've seen the diagram or the imagery on the left. Now I've counteracted that with the move towards, for example, the use of green infrastructure. And the idea here is that maybe instead of always bulldozing over nature, maybe the strategy could be, in particular as the developing world develops, you don't want to strap them with very expensive, debt-ridden kinds of construction plans that, in essence, could have an enormous and negative impact in the long run on the sustainability of the very water systems that they're trying to harness the benefits from. And on the right, we see, that iconically, you preserve wetlands. You get free services. You can begin to, for example, create nursery grounds for fisheries, which are important protein sources in many parts of the world. But if you destroy those functions, you've lost that capacity. Wetlands are also well known for helping you to cleanse water supplies when they're polluted. And if you destroy those functions, you've got to replace it somehow with perhaps very expensive water treatment facilities. So the idea is that maybe if we took a step back and instead of rushing to build all these dams and reservoirs and do nothing else but do that, maybe we need to take a step back and figure out ways in which we could better work with nature, because this is we're really in it for the long haul here. We're trying to sustain the system, and these very systems on the left are well known for destroying the systems virtually instantly. I don't think we've achieved that. There's a lot more opportunity there. And in fact, if you just look at the yellow writing at the bottom of the McKinsey report there and the bottom of the images on the right, I think you see what we're up against. The water sector has a gross income of about $750 billion. That's $0.75 trillion per year. Those are the investments made. And the investments made in protecting the ecosystem, protecting uplands, reconstituting them, preserving wetlands, et cetera. That's a mere, it sounds like it's a lot of money, but it's a mere tens of billions of dollars when you pit it against the $750 billion per year that flows into the water sector, the traditional water sector. Okay. You can't read that. I realize that I can't even read it from here. But let me just make the point. I had the opportunity to work with a couple of interesting Canadians, Magdalena Muir and Bob Sanford. Maybe some of you in the audience know these people. And a fellow from Iceland, Paul Davidson, who runs an organization called Vox Naturae that's trying to alert the world to the peril of a changing cryosphere, losing ice across the planet. And I was honored to be working with them on a workshop effort where we brought together about 60 people. And we talked about the communication of science on this particular ice to non-ice world transition. And we brought together social scientists. We brought together people who studied the psychology of the way belief systems are formulated. We brought bureaucrats in from the government, and we also brought in a mathematician who studies the logic of how people think through problems. And this is a complicated looking diagram, but all it's really trying to say here is that as information is disseminated out of the scientific community, there are many, many opportunities for that scientific knowledge to first of all be misinterpreted at the get-go, at the very beginning. And then you can produce logic streams that are completely consistent. They're mathematically logical, but they lead you to a wrong conclusion. And in fact, climate denial often does that. The climate deniers will start at precisely the wrong place to start. And then they'll create a logic which is completely mathematically sound, but they will wind up in an arena where the science simply will not support that conclusion. And the point here is that if governance is to be good governance, we need to really understand the ways in which a basic, dispassionate, objective piece of information is really knocked back and forth through just the way we are wired as individuals. Just my psychology is different than many of the people in the room, and we look at things differently just from the start. And then you put us into a social system. You put us into a particular governance structure. I'm sure that I think very differently about the effectiveness of my government than perhaps you do, or someone in North Africa where we have very, very different kinds of norms in terms of the functionality of governments. Well, all of that brings you to some end point as to how you view a piece of scientific information. And the point we're trying to make to the U.S. National Science Foundation is that this is a complicated affair, and it really is going to require many hands joining together. Mathematicians, social psychologists, experts in public administration, economists, media experts, to really understand how just that simple fact might get distorted in different arenas. And this leads to either a situation in which you might have very rapid and drastic, draconian or maladaptive actions in some cases, or potentially inaction. And if in fact the governments of the world, or at least in the advanced countries, are pouring lots and lots of money into the research establishment, and that information gets out into the public domain and gets distorted or misused, that's a waste of taxpayer dollars. And I think just from the standpoint of the utilitarian value of knowledge, this is actually a very important question. We didn't realize it until we began to really put this together. Okay, so at this point, I think I end, and thank you for your time. I didn't have a lot of time to go through some of those maps. There's a website there if you wanted to poke around to see exactly the details of what we've done, and I think you'll agree that we're heading in an interesting direction, to say the very least. Thank you.